Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Northshire Presents virtual event. My name is Davith Wood, and I'm the events manager at Northshire's Manchester, Vermont location. A few quick notes before I introduce tonight's author. We are recording tonight's event, but only those of us who are unmuted and speaking in this little yellow box will be on YouTube in perpetuity. So for that reason, if you have any questions for our author tonight, please type them at any point in the chat box. I'll save them up and ask them for you in the Q&A. And finally, before we get things started, just a note of thanks. It's been a challenging year for Northshire and independent bookstores and local businesses of all kinds. We couldn't be here without you. And so we really appreciate the support. You've kept us going. So without further ado, I have been greatly looking forward to tonight's event since I scheduled it. It is my great pleasure to welcome to Northshire Anne Hagedorn, the author of Sleeper Agent, the atomic spy in America who got away. Anne Hagedorn has been a staff writer for the Wall Street Journal and has taught writing at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism and at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. She is the award-winning author of 6 narrative nonfiction books, including Wild Ride, Ransom, Beyond the River, Savage Peace, and Invisible Soldiers. Her new book is Sleeper Agent, the atomic spy in America who got away. A review in the Wall Street Journal called it a historical page-turner of the highest order. And let me throw the buy link up for you in the chat there. While a host of other reviewers have praised her for her superlative investigative talents and called her a masterful historical sleuth and a superb writer. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire Bookstore, Anne Hagedorn. Anne, tell us a little bit about Sleeper Agent.
Oh, thank you very much. First of all, I want to say I'm honored to be here, of course, and thank you all for attending the event. A special thanks before I start my presentation to my former classmates at Denison University, Jennifer Scheid-Williams and Judy Talcott McCormick, for connecting me to this terrific bookstore, which has been open for 45 years. That's an immense and rather exciting accomplishment, especially for those of us who love books, writing them and reading them. So tonight I'll introduce you to my latest book, Sleeper Agent, followed by a few readings from it, and then I'll take questions from the audience. To begin, it's my job as a narrative nonfiction writer to engage general readers about meaningful issues through the art of storytelling. My quest is always to find the compelling narrative that will bring alive for the reader, for the general reader, all issues and individuals at the core of the book's topic. People often ask me, what is the criteria for choosing the topic? The criteria include significance, of course, a topic, especially possibly in danger of falling through the cracks of history. It has to have literary potential. It must be doable research-wise. That's a big, very important point. And it must have general reader appeal. It must also rouse my writerly passions. First, choose the topic, then find the best narrative. That's the usual sequence. But this time I discovered a remarkable story first. It grabbed me from the start, and it all started with an interview I did with a 92-year-old gentleman. I was interviewing for another book idea. I'd been working on that idea for several months and could not nail the narrative. You know, there are 2 ways to do narrative nonfiction. One is you find the story to begin with, as it is with Sleeper Agent, or you search for the narrative that will bring everything alive. So I was in a tough spot, but very determined to keep going. It was a great interview. And at the end of it, he knew I had grown up in Dayton, Ohio. So right toward the end of the interview, I thanked him and he said, "Oh, by the way, I think I have a great idea for you." And of course, I thought, well, that's nice. What is that? He said, did you know about the secret site in Dayton, Ohio, tied to the highly secretive Manhattan Project? And a while ago, he said someone from his realm of academia had told him that a Soviet spy worked there during World War II and lived in the same community where I had spent my childhood. For a week or so after that, I sort of put to use my curiosity mixed with skepticism, and occasionally did some research on it. I still was focused on the other idea, but I could not, partly that mix of skepticism and curiosity can be very powerful. And so in about 2 weeks, I just started exploring, trying to see if I could find the name of the spy, because the gentleman did not know the name. I found an article that had been in the New York Times about a decade before about a Soviet spy who had just received a posthumous award from Vladimir Putin. It was a good story about that event in Moscow, and the name of the spy was there. So I figured this is what the guy's talking about. So then, I made the usual list of what has to be done in order to stick with this, what has to be found, et cetera, et cetera. And before I knew it, I was on the road. Unstoppable research. It was just, I called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press to gain some wisdom on the best approaches to using the Freedom of Information Act and administrative appeals for the FOIA, through the FOIA, and to get FBI reports, and jumped in the car, went to College Park, Maryland, to the National Archives, spent about a week or 10 days there, and interviewed several people in DC. So that, I would say the DC trip was the turning point. So I was convinced that those criteria had been met and I could go forward. So I did, and as all friends and family members can tell you, I barely took a day off from the time I committed to my publisher, committed the proposal to do the book. And, the process of finding letters, journals, postcards, news clips, yearbooks, photos, maps, tax records, ship manifests, passports, arrest records, application forms, all sorts of application forms, even inscriptions in books and thousands of pages of FBI reports. It was quite an adventure. And then there was the regimen of finding and reading applicable secondary sources from scholars who specialized in 20th century anti-Semitism in Russia and America, to the Soviet espionage tactics and networks in the 1930s and 1940s America, to the manufacture of the element polonium, and the timelines of the making of the atomic bomb in the United States and also in the Soviet Union, all in pursuit of putting together the pieces of the life of a Soviet military intelligence officer who, as a US Army corporal, had full security clearance in America's top secret World War II project to build the first atomic bomb. So the who and the when were doable on the challenges list. I was confident about that, but for it to be a true biography, the why, the what, and the how had to be flushed out. And that was not so easy, especially, when you're researching the life of a spy, and especially a spy who was never caught. Thus, you do not have trial transcripts to refer to. Still, it was doable, and Sleeper Agent is indeed the biography of a spy, a Soviet spy who was born and raised in Iowa, Sioux City, Iowa, who was known for charming everyone he met. This was a spy who happened to love baseball. He was a skilled shortstop. He could reel off the history and stats of every big league pitcher. He was especially a fan of the Yankees. He played bridge. He belonged to a bowling league. He was a fan of Walt Whitman and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and was by several accounts quite the ladies' man. He obviously blended well into the American culture, and some of the time he was sending atomic secrets to Moscow to help speed up the creation of their own atomic bomb. Among the most fascinating details is what is revealed in the subtitle of the book, of course, the fact that he was never caught. Like all spy stories, the book gives readers the expected intrigue of some espionage details, the code names. There are lots of code names in it, which was quite an adventure to discover. The various cover shops in Manhattan, the apartments in the Bronx, where he lived, and some of his, as they called his espionage cohorts, fellow travelers lived, including his handler, and then his handler and the suspicious routines of the handler. Those were all quite an adventure, especially I love the part about finding the addresses of the cover shops in New York and then visiting the premises and even interviewing current owners about the history of the buildings to find out what they knew and whether they knew that there had been spies in their buildings, and measuring. I hope the rents didn't go up after that. Yes, you can rent this apartment, but just remember, a Soviet spy operated out of it many years ago, but no. Also measuring distances from the main cover shop, which was on West 23rd Street in Manhattan, to the Flatiron Building where meetings had taken place with Koval's handler. That, by the way, took 5 to 7 minutes walking. But the book goes beyond that. It really goes beyond the espionage, the usual espionage details, because it is a biography that delves into the psychology of the spy, showing the hopes and fears and beliefs that spurred his decisions and accomplishments. Everyone's life must have meaning, and I wanted to unveil the people and events that shaped the meaning of his life, to immerse the reader into the historical context in which the spy functioned. You know, to basically deepen the themes and significance of a typical spy story and connect the reader to what I call the human constants, speaking to the human condition. You know, like the first paragraph of the book connects to a major human constant, right? It's sometimes the clues, quote, sometimes the clues that should have been warnings are lost in a blur, only to be seen in hindsight. Caught in the need to move ahead, most people rush like speeding trains past the truths and half-truths tucked into the terrain they thought they knew. And so it would be for a man and a woman one evening in 1948 at New York City's Grand Central Palace, each soon to learn the timeless cost of missing clues, unquote. By the way, I always write first paragraphs, first parts of a prologue, sometimes the whole prologue of all my books in the New York Public Library reading room. It's a tradition, but anyhow. After reading going back to the human constants and connecting the reader to who the spy really was. After reading an early copy of Sleeper Agent, a good friend of mine, Nick Clooney, told me that Koval's biography basically connected him to the intensity of the Cold War battle of the American dream versus the communist workers' paradise. Nick said that Koval's life personified that struggle. And a Russian scholar knowledgeable about Koval wrote to me a few weeks ago saying this: George Koval's life journey through the 20th century's American and Russian destinies and his work as an intelligence agent had such an impact on world history that his personality and fate will long be the subject of study in both Russia and the United States, unquote. The book also exposes the backlash of bigotry, the persistence of prejudice throughout history, basically the human costs of oppression. Though his self-designed tapestry of lies and half-truths does depict a true traitor to this country, Koval was also a very dedicated scientist, and he was a resilient survivor of anti-Semitism in both Russia and America. So he was someone who knew the human costs of oppression. I'd like to add here a comment that I received yesterday made by Tom Lawrenson, the husband of another of my good college friends, this time Alice Batson Lawrenson. And his comment was, quote, "Like a good novel, I'm led to an understanding of the lead character. George Koval wasn't a killer or doing any great evils. Many Americans would do for their country of birth what he did for his country of culture and political leaning," unquote. I thought that was an interesting observation. Koval's story also shows the expertise and determination of Russian military intelligence and how we've often underestimated Russian capabilities in technology and science in general. As former Defense Secretary and CIA Chief James Schlesinger said at the time of the discovery of bugs in the structure of the US Embassy in Moscow, that was in 1985, and this is taken from the book. His testimony included this about the constant bugging of US embassies in Moscow. "The culprit is American complacency, the tendency to assume that the Russians are technically inferior to us and that we can always handle them." He actually called that particular building situation the best bugged building ever built. That was in the testimony. You enjoy that, but interesting. Another important point to make here is perhaps that, this is also a spy story that transcends the debates about the scale of Soviet espionage in wartime America and turns the reader's attention to the fact that scapegoating, opportunism, and bigotry blurred the vision of what was truly happening regarding the Soviet spy networks. J. Edgar Hoover knew there were such networks, but he was often hunting in the wrong territory. For example, he thought that all members of the Communist Party USA had to be spies, but look at George Koval. He played bridge, belonged to a bowling league, not the Communist Party USA. And he mingled with his scientific peers in an electrical engineering honorary fraternity, not with his fellow travelers. His espionage peers. He simply blended in. So the book answers long lingering questions about Koval's life. It brings to light many new details. It reveals why he was undetected, and it shows there were basically no coincidences in the narrative of his life. As a source of mine from years ago when I was at the Wall Street Journal, a former federal prosecutor actually told me when I asked him about the best ways to investigate a story, he said use timelines and chronologies and never accept coincidences. So one good example, there are several examples in Sleeper Agent of that, and one good one is the fact that George Koval enrolled in the University Extension Program at Columbia in 1941, shortly after he returned to America as a Red Army trained spy. He returned in late 1940. That fact was simply a line in an FBI report, and without any context. And of course, you know, and he got a B, by the way, in his chemistry course. But anyhow, it's a great example of what could appear just to be detailed little significance and perhaps a coincidence, but with some study, mainly timelines and about what was happening then in nuclear physics, it becomes far more important than you know, somebody taking a chemistry course at an Ivy League school because he loved science or wanted to make friends at his new home in New York City. To be sure, by the time Koval's enrollment, time of his enrollment in 1941, Columbia had become a magnet for some of the most highly regarded physicists and chemists in the world, some destined to play stellar roles in the upcoming production of our first atomic bomb. And there had been a very detailed front page article in the New York Times on May 5th, 1940, about what was happening at Columbia in physics, an article that Koval's handler no doubt had read. Anyhow, so you take a fact, dig further, establish some timelines, and then the truth begins to surface. One of my favorite details was Koval's job at Oak Ridge, one of the sites, as I'm sure the audience knows, of the Manhattan Project, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as a health physicist. It was known that he was assigned to Oak Ridge, a line on all of his forms and applications. But exactly what did he do there? That was the big question, the revealing question, with a revealing answer. So what was his daily routine and how would that affect his access to top secret information? And I did a lot of digging in what's called the Oak Ridge Room at the Oak Ridge Public Library, and I found many details about the department he was part of. In Oak Ridge, he was trained to be a health physicist, and he was part of the health physics department, which of course measured levels of radiation contamination, and such work required routine access to confidential and secret information. In fact, most, if not all, information pertaining to health physics during Koval's tenure at Oak Ridge was classified. Health physicists had to learn the basic chemical properties of all the radioactive materials they were monitoring. Oak Ridge was the site in the Manhattan Project that was producing the fuels for the bomb. So, you know, health physicists were asked to be present whenever repair work was done on any equipment at the uranium, plutonium, polonium plants, and no shipment could leave the site without the approval of the health physics department. I mean, think about this. The health physicists conducted routine surveys of all offices and labs as they checked for signs of contamination. And there were all kinds of manuals in that archive. One, I included just a few details in the book. 3 important steps for the health physics workers were always noted in their training materials. Quote, know all operations in your area. Be alert to all changes. Make thorough surveys on a regular basis. So this is, you know, a Red Army trained spy doing the job as a health physicist at Oak Ridge. So finding such details are what I call the aha moments. There were numerous examples of those in the process of piecing together Koval's life. At the National Archives, I actually shouted aha when I discovered a very helpful 250-page file. And I must have been humming the ahas when I walked the streets of Manhattan and the Bronx to map out Koval, where Koval and his fellow travelers had worked and lived. But for now, you know, like all authors, I could talk more about the book, but I want to close just with, I'll do, if I have time, I'll just read a few I had a professor at Columbia who said that never fall in love with your own writing. And that's exactly true. Actually, no, that was a Wall Street Journal editor. Never fall in love with your own writing. And she was exactly right. But we can have, because humility really breeds excellence, but we can have some favorite parts. I think we're allowed to have that. But anyhow, first, I will close with my hopes for the book. I hope Sleeper Agent will deepen the reader's understanding of the intriguing psychology of a spy. We should understand what motivates spies and of the timeless cost of oppression, and that it will be helpful to future researchers and contribute to what is a step-by-step process of prying open the closed chapters in the story of Soviet espionage in wartime America. Okay, so how many minutes do I have? I'll read a few things.
Go for it, you got plenty.
Okay, so I read you the first paragraph of the prologue, right? And that sort of sets the scene. Prologues really need to be, very deep thematically, and also, of course, lure the reader through and set up some basic, points of significance. I won't tell you the rest of the prologue, but the importance of the prologue is that it's exactly the turning point. It's the point at which George Koval realizes he has to leave America. He's been there for 8 years as a Soviet spy, and he must leave in the autumn of 1948. And the last two paragraphs, and he has a date. He's been dating someone who believes that his parents are dead, that he grew up in an orphanage in Cleveland, Ohio, and all the half-truths and lies he believes he's told her. So the last two paragraphs of the prologue are: though documents and interviews would someday expose parts of the truth about Koval's escape from America, some questions would never be answered, like what he was thinking as he watched the New York skyline diminish and the ocean's vast expanse draw near. Was he remembering the last time he had left America in May 1932 with his parents and his two brothers on a ship leaving from Pier 54, bound eventually for the Soviet Union? Or the details of his father's stories about being a Russian immigrant and seeing America for the first time in 1910? Did he have the manner of a professional, lacking last-minute hesitations or sentimentality as the ship passed by the great statue symbolizing the freedoms of the country that was his birthplace? And did he struggle to push back all thoughts of what and whom he was leaving behind? By November, Koval would be living in the Soviet Union in Moscow with his wife of 12 years, and he would soon reunite with his 65-year-old father, his 58-year-old mother, and one of his two brothers. What he told them about his past 8 years in America on a business trip for Soviet military intelligence is unknown, but one certain fact is that George Koval left the US just in time. And as anyone who knew him would likely say, his timing was always nearly perfect. So that brings the reader into parts 1, 2, and 3. Part 1 is the lure, which gives you a sense of why he did what he did and how he got into it. Then part 2 is the deception, which gets into, what he actually did and where and how, to whom he was connected, et cetera, et cetera. And then part 3 is the hunt, and then an epilogue. So I could read you one more, and I think I'll read you something my Russian translator is very proud of. I had a very hard time finding out how he got back into the country. He was recruited as a Red Army military spy. In 1939, he was trained 39 into 40, and then came back to America with a false passport. But how did he do it, and where, and when? With the help of the my wonderful Russian translator, we found about 4 different avenues of resources that put together this story of his return. So I'll do that one. I think it's interesting. And that is the beginning of part 2, chapter 5. The title is Undercover in the Bronx. One September night in 1940, somewhere in the East China Sea, mountainous waves were tossing a small cargo ship on which George Koval was en route from Vladivostok, a port in the far southeast corner of the Soviet Union, to San Francisco. Quote, "We almost got into the center of a cyclone," he wrote in a letter to his wife. Quote, "The rocking was huge and all books and furniture were falling on us as we fell off our beds," unquote. Crossing 4,554 nautical miles, the trip would take more than 3 weeks, adding to Koval's 6-day, 5,772-mile train journey from Moscow to Vladivostok. During the calm days, when the winds were a total delight, Koval wrote that he played chess or dominoes with the ship's captain and read stories to the captain's 9-year-old daughter, who called him Uncle Grisha. Bonding with the captain's family on such a long passage would prove essential when the ship docked in America. Though he carried a fake passport, Koval planned to help unload the cargo and then slip away, possibly to a meeting place in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he would be given whatever was needed for his continuing travels. Because it was a cargo ship, at that time, the Customs Patrol didn't process entry papers for crew members returning in a quick turnaround to Vladivostok. Still, US officials conducted a seemingly thorough inspection of the ship, during which Koval hid a storage bench in the captain's quarters. Sitting on top were the captain, his wife, and his daughter. The English-speaking inspectors asked to see identification documents for the captain and his family, a process that apparently took longer than the little girl could tolerate. And so she looked up at her mother and asked in Russian, "Will Uncle Grisha have to stay under the couch much longer?" Unquote. The mother smiled and said nothing and continued to hold her daughter's hand while her husband focused on the officials. The calm response of the mother and father, plus the fact that the inspectors likely knew little, if any, Russian, or were simply paying no attention to a little girl's exchange with her mother, saved the day for the Soviet spy. Soon, Koval was boarding a train to New York City. So that's, so probably we should take questions now. And if there's time left over, I'll read a couple paragraphs about Koval's return to Russia, or the US Embassy in Moscow, which Koval enters in, I think it's 1999, and applies for Social Security, actually, from the US. But at any rate, if there's time, I'll read one more thing. But right now, we need to pay attention to the audience. So what questions do we have?
Well, thank you so much, Anne. We have a question already. It was DM'd to me by Edward. He said, was this your first experience with applying for a Freedom of Information Act, FOAI, and how long of a delay did you experience before you obtained the material that you needed?
No, I've used it before. I did call the Reporters Committee to get some advice because I hadn't used it for several years. So some things had changed, I think, for the Freedom of Information Act, and I just wanted to I wanted to talk to some current experts about it, but no, I've done it before. Some things took quite a while, and that's why the discoveries that I made at the National Archives were especially helpful. Some came very quickly. I mean, relatively quickly, like within 6 months. Some were very redacted, some weren't. I mean, they were all redacted, but some less than others. And I submitted several administrative appeals, which I did not win. Which is too bad because there were a couple sections I really would like to have had better access to. There was well, anyhow, that answers the question. If you read the acknowledgements, you can read about a woman who was very helpful regarding FOIA at the FBI, Leanna Ramsey, I think her name was. And you know, a couple of them, there's still one request I still haven't received. And one came through when I was completing the edits for the book. And so reading through, actually, I think I was fact-checking the second pass through, what they call the second pass. So that couldn't be included. So it was, in answer to your question, sometimes it took quite a while, obviously, and sometimes it didn't, and that's the way it always is. But it's very important to know the best approaches to filling out the forms for what you want. And there are some, you know, smart pieces of advice that you can get from a place like the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. They really know what they're doing regarding the FOIA.
Edward has a follow-up question too. He says, did you have to have the manuscript reviewed or approved by the NSA before it was published?
What? No, not that I know of.
Maybe they did anyway. I have a question for you. So about the lure, what was the lure for Koval? Was it just the ideology of the Soviet Union?
Oh, the lure for Koval. I thought you meant the lure for me writing about him. That's an excellent question. And I've often thought, what would I ask him if I could do an interview with him? And that would be my first question. I would say, you know, when you come to conclusions about questions like that, you have to look at the context. You have to look at all the timelines. So you have to realize what was happening in his life in September of 1939, basically September 1st, 1939, the beginning of World War II, and the change in his Army requirements. And he had just finished his degree at Mendeleev Institute in chemistry in Moscow, all set to go. He had just been accepted for his graduate degree. And then things began to happen in September 1939. The combination of that timeline and the fact that he, as you can see in the book, there are some details about some reprimands, some problems that he and his wife were having regarding an individual in the building they lived, sending in reports about them. There's just a combination. He owned a typewriter. You know, his wife was from an aristocrat, from aristocracy, from Imperial Russia. There were a lot of points against them at that point. Plus, you know, so I think the lure, you know, certainly wasn't money. There was the ideology, I mean, the idealism, as you read in his family, was that he grew up with. So the idealism is one issue or one lure, but I think the biggest lure was his loyalty to his family, because I think, you know, he knew if he was a GRU, a military intelligence officer, his family was going to be better taken care of if anything happened to him while he was in the Army fulfilling assignments. So I think I think, you know, you have probably 4 different possibilities of what the lure was, but I think the top one was his loyalty to his family. He wanted to protect his family. Yeah.
Thanks. One of our local authors in Saratoga is Steve Shank, and he's a YA author of nonfiction books. And wow. He said that he was inspired to write not his latest, but his book on the bomb by an article about Koval. And he had started by sort of pursuing that and then abandoned it because he was worried that there wasn't enough unclassified information. Right. Can you sort of talk about sort of what work did you find that really that was classified or was declassified that really sort of made everything hooked together? Anything from Russia either, for that matter?
Well, you have to read the acknowledgments. If you read the acknowledgments, then you also read the introduction to the source notes, and you read through the source notes. There are about 35 or 40 pages of notes. You can see where everything came from. Many archives, many resources, and it took 4 years. So, you know, there was your hesitation was probably quite smart, but you know, it was you know, an immense job because of the different domains. Like I said earlier, the domains of the secondary sources. You know, I mean, just the part about the science, and you know. Finding nuclear physicists to explain the polonium and the trigger, and exactly the difference between synthesizing polonium and finding a natural source for the polonium, and then how that fuel for the trigger was made through irradiating bismuth. But so, you know, so much there's the science. I mean, in order to tell the story of a Soviet spy who had infiltrated the Manhattan Project, you really have to understand the science, and you have to understand the Soviet networks and how they based on the documents of those who were detected or who did defect, like the cipher clerk in Canada in I think it was September 1945. And so what you do is you go piece by piece, you put together many timelines, you know, and chronologies, and then you you know, try to find all of the details, and through chronologies you find intersections of action, and that's how you can find. I mean, just like that, the federal prosecutor advised, use timelines, use chronologies, and you can discover all kinds of things. So. But it was, I had a great Russian translator who did a lot of digging for me. And we worked, we met every 2 weeks for about 2 years, I think. And then I had a research assistant who put together many timelines and who also indexed the thousands of pages of FBI reports. And some, you know, some of those files I did get declassified, which is great. But many were already unclassified. But I think the science was a big challenge. At one point, I had to read this 400-page report that was came out of the Atomic Energy Commission in 1956 about the Dayton Project and the making of polonium. You know, it was, but after, you know, studying all of that, I was fascinated by it. and reading through as many parts of Richard Rhodes' book on the atomic bomb. I mean, it was quite an education. If I turned to this camera around to the bookshelf in front of me, it contains all the secondary sources that I studied to be sure I was on solid ground. And then if I felt I, wasn't, then I would find an expert who was, and, so, but it was from door to door, I really started it in 2016 and then completed it in early 2021. So, yeah, but at any rate.
Thanks. Well, if there are any more questions, please type them in the chat. But maybe, Anne, why don't you read the passage that you were thinking about? The one about the embassy sounded very interesting.
Oh, you want the
90s,
yeah. Yeah, that's rather interesting. Yeah, so George Koval returns some very important details in his years after returning to the Soviet Union, answering the question of why there wasn't a parade, basically, for him when he returned because of what he did. And that was because of Stalin and his anti-Americanism and also the anti-Semitism that was just blazing when Koval returned in the autumn of 1948. So then we go further, and here we are in 1999, and here's the way in. This is actually the beginning of the closing chapter. There's an epilogue that follows, but I think as Americans, I think you'll be interested in some of these details. Okay. The grand opening of the newly constructed U.S. Embassy in Moscow in May 2000 was one of those events that seems to exalt and shame simultaneously. Pride must have blazed the walls as the speeches rolled out and the glasses clinked, for there was no doubt that the postmodern building of stone and glass was quite an architectural and political accomplishment. At the same time, the occasion was a disturbing reminder that the entire project had taken more than 30 years to complete, a time during which high-profile gaffes had earned America's Moscow embassy such headline images as bungled and bugged. After a 1969 agreement to proceed with a new embassy, the construction finally began in the fall of 1979 with directives calling for the Soviet Union to use its own labor and materials to build the basic structure. The host country was also given the right to review architectural drawings for the building's frame, quote, to ensure that it met local Soviet building codes and standards, unquote. But 6 years later, the Soviet workers were ejected from the site and work was suspended after Soviet listening devices implanted in concrete pillars were found in the structural shell of the building. Then it would take many more years for the US and the USSR to agree to a solution for dealing with such permanent eavesdropping systems, while Americans debated the prickly issue of slipshod scrutiny. As former Defense Secretary and CIA Chief James Schlesinger, I gave you that quote earlier, at the time of the discovery, the culprit is the tendency to assume that the Russians are technically inferior to us, et cetera, et cetera. Through the years, there had been attempts to plant devices at the old embassy, which had opened in 1953, such as the Soviets' gift of a large replica of the Great Seal of the United States, replete with a tiny listening mechanism found only after it had been hanging on the wall of the US ambassador's study for nearly 2 decades. Then in the 1960s, 40 microphones had been found in the embassy walls. And in the 1980s, bugs were discovered in at least a dozen electric typewriters, one of which, one of them used by the secretary of the second-ranking embassy diplomat. These were sensors capable of picking up the contents of typed documents. There were also the honey trap cases, including a scandal around the same time as the shocking find at the new embassy construction site. This one involved a Marine security guard arrested and soon convicted of espionage after his affair with a Soviet woman working at the US Embassy. The woman had a KGB handler. Perhaps there would always be walls with ears at the embassy, though what was learned by such astute listening was not always picked up by the press. In 1999, for example, a somewhat significant spy story moved across the embassy landscape, missed by the media searchlight. In early June, a thin, stooped, bespectacled 85-year-old George Koval entered the American embassy without notice, 40 years after US officials had invited him there. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that brings, we don't have time to go into that, but he's entering the embassy to fill out a form in order to get an application from the US Social Security Administration for a benefit, because he had been in the US Army and he had found out about a benefit that he might have access to. Anyhow, so that's that one. But anyhow, so read the book.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
There's another question here from your friend Judy. She says, do you think that he had any regrets after he experienced the anti-Semitism in Russia?
Oh, wow, such a great question. And yeah, and actually I answer it in the book. That plagued me. Especially because of Stalin and the purges, and all of the details about at that time during which he was recruited in 1939, and also the first chapter of, I was going to read you that, but no time, but the first chapter of part 3, when he does return, and that, just raging anti-Semitism in Moscow at that time. How could he view communism as the ism that would end world oppression? How could he continue to believe that? Did he have regrets later in life? And as you'll read, he reconnects with one of his Oak Ridge colleagues. And actually I interviewed and just had an exchange with a 98-year-old man who was double dated with George Koval in Oak Ridge. And actually we're trying to put together a sort of event where the 98-year-old gentleman and I discuss the Soviet spy. But at any rate, another of his colleagues in Oak Ridge reconnected to him in the late 1990s and the early part of the new century, and asked him that very question. And it's in the book. What his answer was, he had no regrets. And so that was when that is when anyone looking at the list of the reason people become spies, I think that sort of answers the question. He had no regrets. He returned, when he returned to Russia, one of his brothers was killed 1943 in battle. But his family was still alive. All of the members of his family were still alive, et cetera, et cetera. So I think when he said he had no regrets, he had no regrets for that commitment. As a scientist, he probably believed in nuclear parity. And so I think his dedication as a scientist, and I think his loyalty to his family probably are the reasons for that statement. But my job as a writer is to find as many details that can be totally nailed down as possible, so that the a discussion like this can take place, you know, so we don't know. If we couldn't interview him, we don't know. But there is that documentation in the exchange with his former colleague in which he did say he had no regrets. So I feel very fortunate that there are those details that I could include in the book. Yeah.
Well, Anne, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. The book is Sleeper Agent. I'm afraid we're out of time for tonight. We could continue listening to this for another hour, I think. Anne, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Sleeper
thank
Agent.
You
can order it in Northshire from Northshire. The link is in the chat.
Northshire, yeah.
And many thanks, and we'll hopefully see you in person soon with the 98-year-old. You're both invited.
After this, that would be great. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Judy McCord.
Thank you, Judy. Good recommendation here. Fantastic. And have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great to meet you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Okay. Bye-bye.